Canadian Member of Parliament Tamara Jansen has put forward the most important piece of legislation in a generation, and it is supported by Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre. It is Bill C-218, the Right to Recover Act, and it would ban euthanasia for mental illness and disability. Let me read Pierre's statement for you here, because we gave him a pretty hard time on this podcast during the election when this issue was almost totally ignored. And so his statement here is very welcome and very encouraging. Here is what he wrote on X on July 10. MP Tamara Jansen's The Right to Recover Act will save countless lives. It says that mental illness is not sufficient grounds for medical assistance in dying. Thanks to MP Andrew Lawton for courageously sharing his story. That's at the press conference, which we'll be showing you shortly. Our loved ones suffering with their mental health deserve support, not assisted death from the government. Recovery is possible. We will not give up on them. That is precisely the message that we need to be hearing from every politician, and it's very encouraging to see that coming from the Conservative Party leader of Canada. On July 9, Tamara Jansen hosted a press conference to discuss Bill C-218, the Right to Recover Act, including Member of Parliament Andrew Lawton of Elgin, St. Thomas, London South, former New Brunswick Lieutenant Governor Graydon Nicholas, and Alicia Duncan, who is an anti-euthanasia advocate whose mother was euthanized during a mental health crisis in 2021. That story is truly horrifying. I was going to share some stories with you on today's show. Instead, we're going to start by showing you Alicia's story. This is her testimony at the press conference. This happened in Canada, and as she warns, this is the kind of thing that will happen regularly if this bill does not pass. Here is her story.
In February of 2020, my mom was in a minor car accident. My young daughter was in the car at the time, and she was completely fine. However, my mom was diagnosed with a concussion, and 3 weeks later, we went into COVID lockdown. It was very difficult for my mom to access care at the time, and over the next 20 months, her health slowly deteriorated. She began losing weight. The doctors were unable to determine what the cause could be. They ruled out everything from cancer to fibromyalgia. It was 2 days before my mom's scheduled medical assistance in dying that she let us know that she would be dead in less than 48 hours. And my sister and I, knowing that she had no terminal diagnosis, no diagnosis other than depression, that something was very wrong. And we believed that we could stop this because surely the law would protect someone like my mom in a mental health crisis. And so we went to the police. And the police told us that there was nothing we could do, that they could do, because all of the paperwork was in place. We were outraged and we could not believe that this was happening. And they told us that in order for us to stop this, we would need a court order. And so we went to the provincial courthouse and we pled for my mom's life in an emergency hearing. And thankfully, the judge granted us a warrant for my mom's arrest under the Mental Health Act. Sadly, my mom, who was suffering from suicidal ideation, attempted to take her own life, and she ended up being sectioned, ironically, in the psychiatric unit that she used to manage as a psychiatric nurse. I can't explain to you how traumatic it is to be relieved that your mom is in a psychiatric unit. We thought at this point she would be safe, that she would be protected. But 48 hours later, under the Canadian law, she was assessed again, and being a psychiatric nurse, she knew exactly the things to say to pass the assessments. And 4 hours later, we received a text message that my mom was dead and her body had been taken to a crematorium. I have since been diagnosed with PTSD. My sister has been diagnosed with PTSD. And under the expansion of our law in 2027, this would qualify us for medical assistance in dying. That irony is also not lost on us. Over the past 3.5 years since my mom's passing, my sister and I have spoken in parliaments worldwide. We have shared our story on international media platforms to warn people what can happen when we trust that the legislation is going to protect vulnerable people like my mom. My mom, who was self-starving, who was starving herself, who was 78 pounds at the time of her death, was not protected by our laws because under our current legislation, she was deemed as someone who was terminal. Let me be clear, my mom had no terminal diagnosis. I have spent over $40,000 with the top law firm in Canada fighting to get my mom's MAID assessment records. Her death was the first investigation into a MAID death in Canada, and the police were forced to close their investigation because the Fraser Health Authority to this day has refused to release my mom's MAID assessment records. Our family believes that the law was not followed, and there is absolutely no recourse for families to ensure that my mother's death was lawful. I believe it is morally irresponsible to consider expanding a law that has so many gaps currently that someone with a mental health condition who starved themselves could be approved. This is just one sad case of an example of what can happen, and I am terrified about what will happen in March 2027 if we allow this to expand for people who do have mental health conditions. I highly encourage every single person to contact their MP to support this bill. This is not an issue for any political party. This is a human rights issue, and I really just want to reiterate that we can't protect our family members. There's nothing we can do to protect our family members and our loved ones if we don't change the legislation. And so I just want to thank Tamara again for bringing this to our attention, and so we can hopefully save vulnerable people like my mom. Thank you.
Duncan's story is so important because if the sunset clause comes into effect in 2027, and the sunset clause, for those of you who might have forgotten, is when the eligibility for euthanasia will be expanded to those suffering solely from mental illness or disability, then what happened to her mother will become common in Canada. This is something that every one of the speakers at the press conference emphasized. And the reason Duncan's story is so powerful is because it gives us a face-to-face chance to see what it looks like when a family is impacted in this way. This will impact every family in Canada if it comes into effect. This has already been delayed 2 times. Why has it been delayed? Because of public pushback, because of almost unanimous opposition from mental health organizations, from medical organizations, from disability rights organizations, which are unanimous on this issue. The primary people pushing it are Dying with Dignity, a pro-euthanasia group that doesn't want to just legalize MAID for mental illness, but also wants to expand euthanasia in other ways. And that is why stopping the spread of Canada's euthanasia regime is essential. And it must be stopped here, where the most vulnerable people will be subject to exploitation, and where the families of those vulnerable people, like the Duncans, will be helpless to protect their loved ones. And so here is Tamara Jansen explaining why this bill is so important and why it is so important now.
Most of us know someone struggling with mental illness. Maybe it's a son or daughter, a mother or father battling depression, feeling like the world has left them behind. Now imagine that when they go for help, that they're faced with long delays and no access to support, but instead they're offered MAID. And that's where Canada is headed in 2027 if we don't change course. So that's why I've introduced Bill C-218, the Right to Recover Act. This would make it illegal to offer medical assistance in dying to someone whose sole medical condition is a mental illness. Now, this bill is without saying. We don't give up on people. This bill would put an end to MAID for solely mental illness. Now, MAID for mental illness doesn't protect the vulnerable. It targets them. It reaches people not when they're stable, but when they're at their lowest. And they're in crisis, isolated, without enough support. So we're here because with mental illness, recovery and hope is possible. People can get better, and Canadians struggling with their mental health deserve care and support, not a state-sanctioned path to death.
Tamara Jansen was also joined, as I mentioned, by Andrew Lawton, who may be familiar to many of you because for years he was a radio host, he was a podcast host, he is the author of 2 best-selling books, including one which landed on the Globe and Mail bestseller list for many, many years. He's also a suicide survivor who has spoken publicly and courageously about his own journey and has said that if MAID for mental illness was law, when he went through his own mental health crisis, he likely wouldn't be here today. And he shared that story at the press conference. Here it is.
I'll say up front that C-218, the Right to Recover Act, will save lives. My name is Andrew Lawton. I'm the Member of Parliament for Elgin, St. Thomas, London South in Ontario, and I am also a suicide survivor. 15 years ago, I very nearly succeeded in ending my life to suicide. I had an intentional overdose and was in the hospital on life support and in a coma for several weeks. This was the culmination of what had been a years-long battle with mental illness, and one that I very nearly lost. Now, I want to share a few things that are important for context here, in that suicide is something that if someone is inclined to do it, and they share this with a medical practitioner, it activates a responsibility, a legal and ethical responsibility to treat that person. One of the gravest issues with the laws that are set to go into effect in 2027 is the lack of differentiation between someone with suicidal ideation who needs to be stopped and supported versus someone who walks into a medical office and seeks MAID as a service because of their mental illness. And that is one of the most important things that needs to be addressed in this. At the end of the day, people who went through what I went through 15 years ago believe that their life cannot get better. They believe that there is no hope, that there's no chance of happiness, no chance of success. I never would have believed at my lowest point in 2010 that I could be standing here today as a member of Parliament, as a husband, as someone that has a life that I'm so happy with. And all of that was only possible because I was given the support and care that I needed to go through what I did and come out the other side. The message that I share with anyone who's struggling with mental illness is that I got better. And no matter how difficult and how painful it is to be living with mental illness, to be living with the desire in some cases to end your life, there is hope. And it's incumbent upon all of us as a society, as a community, the healthcare field, the government, to keep hope alive, to ensure that patients, that people struggling have a right to recover. And that's what this bill does. And as Tamara mentioned, I am not convinced that I would be here today if MAID were available 15 years ago for people with mental illness. And the reason I share that is because I was very rational and logical. I had, with myself, justified why mental illness was, or why suicide was the right thing to do for me, why it made sense. And I could have and would have made that case to a physician as well, that I did not believe life could get better, that I did not want to give it a chance, that I wanted to avail myself of this right. When we license the usage of MAID for people with mental illness, we are actually giving credence to the idea that hopelessness is permissible and that hopelessness is what we should be embodying when it's the opposite. So the reason I was so honored to second Tamara's bill is because this will save lives. We have a near consensus among so many different groups and stakeholders, people connected to communities that see disproportionate suicides in their communities, of people representing the healthcare fields, medical ethics, all of whom are saying that this is not a road that we should go down as a country. So I am encouraging all members of Parliament to vote for C-218. I am encouraging all Canadians to ask their members of Parliament to support this bill. This is not something that should be partisan. This is something that will literally save lives. And there are very few things in law that we can say that about as clearly as we can with Bill C-218. There is going to be in the coming weeks a national campaign that we are going to be launching that will encourage Canadians to tell their stories, because my story is not at all in isolation. I have been from the bottom to now a place that I am very happy with, and I know that so many have gone through that journey as well. And through this campaign, we hope to not just instill hope for people who are struggling with mental illness, but also point out the fundamental flaw with the incoming changes to MAID that we hope to correct with Bill C-218, and that is that hope is always possible, and we need to ensure there is always a right to recover. Thank you very much.
Another clip from the third speaker that we want to show you is from former New Brunswick Lieutenant Governor Graydon Nicholas. And he, of course, is also very much involved in the Indigenous community, speaking for their rights. And he speaks from an Indigenous perspective when he condemns Canada's spreading euthanasia regime. And in fact, he represents many Indigenous voices when he spoke at this press conference, because many members of the Indigenous community have been very opposed to what Canada is doing and rightly see Canada's euthanasia regime as exploitative and a direct threat to the lives of members of those communities who struggle with mental health and are often particularly vulnerable to the new eligibility standards, which should roll in 2027. So here is former New Brunswick Lieutenant Governor Graydon Nicholas.
This is what I'm trying to participate in this discussion and promote and advocate, that we do have to help people. They're in desperate need. And when you're struggling, it's hard for you to get help. It's hard to ask for help because so many times the door at the help center has been shut down. So this bill is that of recovery. You know, when I was Lieutenant Governor of New Brunswick, there was a phrase I always used in Latin. It's called spem reduxit, which means there's hope. And that's what the theme was at the time of Lieutenant Governor, way before I was Lieutenant Governor, spem reduxit, restoring hope. And so this is the beauty of this particular theme, is we have to restore hope. And how do we do it? It involves all of us. It involves our spiritual dimensions. It involves everybody to say a loss of one life is too much.
So before we get into some of the numbers that highlight why Tamara Jansen's bill is, I think, the most important piece of Canadian legislation in a generation, we want to just show you a highlight reel from the press conference, because there was a Q&A after each of these three speakers laid out their reasons for supporting the bill and shared their own personal experiences. And that Q&A brought forward a lot of really important issues that so many Canadians are unaware of. And indeed, a couple of the reporters emphasized that so much of what Andrew and Tamara and the former Lieutenant Governor were saying, and Alicia, so much of what they were saying was just not known. Alicia Duncan's story is horrifying. Many Canadians have not heard this story at all. We could add to her story stories like that of Alan Nichols, another BC man who was euthanized after being taken to the hospital for a mental health crisis. And so one of the big tasks ahead of us is just bringing facts that we know to the Canadian public to ensure that they can reach out to their MPs, contact them, share their own perspectives and stories, and make sure Bill C-218 becomes law, hopefully by the end of the year. So here's a highlight reel of some of the answers that the participants in the press conference gave to the reporters who showed up to cover it.
We have to look at the way that the expansion of MAID in Canada has been viewed around the world and condemned by the United Nations, by other countries, and even countries that have what we would view as traditionally more relaxed restrictions or regulations around MAID have still looked at Canada as an example of where not to go with it. And I think this expansion of MAID to people with mental illness is really the line that even a lot of people in Canada who may be fundamentally supportive of MAID view as being a bridge too far. And I think we need to rally around the idea that there is very broad consensus for this among Canadians, among a lot of Canadian stakeholder groups, and that the rest of the world is watching. And I think Canada needs to do the right thing and pass Bill C-218.
Malin Jordan, Cloverland reporter. Every time there seems to be some pushback against MAID in this country, whether it be legally or just kind of public consensus, it seems to swing so far the other way that we're sitting here going, how did that happen? What kind of plan do you have to get behind this bill and so it can get some traction and possibly get passed? Like, what's your plan for that?
Well, first of all, I think it's really good news to know that the first time this bill was originally put forward by Ed Fast, We actually got very close to passing it. I think we only needed, 9 more votes? So I actually do believe that this particular bill has a very good chance of passing.
When Ed Fast's bill in the previous Parliament came forward, I was so pleased to see that it had support from the entire Conservative caucus, the entire New Democrat caucus, the entire Green caucus, and several individual Liberal members of Parliament. And I think that's important to point out because there was across the board, across party lines, support for this. Obviously, we needed a little bit more. But my hope is that with C-218, we can build off of that and encourage representatives of all parties, because this is not a partisan issue, to support this. Everyone in Canada is affected by mental illness in some way, whether it's their own experience or that of a loved one or family member or friend. And there is a staggering number that are affected by suicide as well. So we need to be building these bridges, and I'm going to be working as hard as I can to connect with representatives of other parties on this as well. I sit on the House of Commons Justice Committee, which I hope will have an opportunity to review this bill if we can get it to that stage. But there was already tremendous support in the political system and hugely from Canadians at large. And I just hope we see Canadians tell their members of Parliament how important this is.
Really, it's important just educating people. Most people that I speak to don't realize that you can't access MAID unless you're terminal. And what's actually true is that you can access MAID within 24 hours now in Canada. And people don't understand that. And so just really discussing, I know huge pro organizations like Dying with Dignity love to talk about how, 78% of Canadians support medical assistance in dying, but it's a faulty Ipsos poll that was taken. And when you just ask people in theory about whether they agree with this, they say they do. But when you actually talk about the details of the law and how people can be approved, support actually drops to about 10 to 11%. And so it really is just educating, speaking to people. I'm active with different groups and, obviously Tamara, and just sharing our stories. So we have no legal avenue really to fight this. And so we're just going to keep speaking as loudly as we can.
What were your communications with the police like,
Right.
Generally speaking? Do you feel like they took your concerns seriously?
Absolutely, yeah. It was the Abbotsford Police Department that investigated. My mom lived and died in Abbotsford. And they were absolutely wonderful to work with. They took our case very seriously. Major crimes investigated for almost 10 months. And at that point, they were talking to so many different professionals and organizations trying to just really understand the law and how this could have happened. Their own requests with my approval were denied to access the MAID assessment records. And so we really collaborated on the entire process. And I felt that they were just as upset as we were when they were forced to close the investigation. And I'm just very grateful for the support that we did get, because I do believe that it gave us the credibility to speak on the platforms that we've been able to.
So I want to really emphasize what each of these speakers said, and they've shared their personal stories, and those personal stories are incredibly powerful. But I want to bring a bit of data to the table to back up what they're saying, to highlight not only how important this bill is, but how dire the situation is in Canada currently for those who struggle with their mental health. Everybody in Canada knows somebody who struggles with mental illness. Everybody knows somebody who has struggled with suicidal ideation. Many know somebody who has attempted suicide. Let me give you a few numbers, and these are Canadian numbers. Approximately 1 in 5 Canadians, 1 in 5, struggle with a mental health problem or illness. That's about 50% of Canadians, half, by the age of 40. So these eligibility standards are very, very all-encompassing. This has nothing to do with the very narrow path to medical aid in dying that Canadian government promised back in 2016. This is opening the floodgates, which is what these speakers were warning about. About 5.4% of Canadians struggle with major depression, again, which would qualify all of these Canadians under the 2027 Sunset Clause for a lethal injection delivered by a Canadian healthcare practitioner. In 2021, about 4.3% of Canadians reported experiencing suicidal ideation, or the desire to commit suicide. Among people between the ages of 18 and 34, that number went up to 8%, and it gets worse. Among the subgroup of those who were 18 to 24, that number was 10%. So in 2021, 10% of those between the ages of 18 and 24 struggled with suicidal ideation. This means an unbelievably large number of people will be eligible for assisted suicide if the 2027 sunset clause is not stopped by Bill C-218. One of my friends who attempted suicide multiple times has shared her story publicly, has said, for those of us who were attempting to commit suicide during our mental health crises, we had the will to commit suicide, but we didn't have the means to commit suicide. What the 2027 sunset clause will do is provide people with the will to commit suicide with the means to commit suicide. Consider that fact in the context of 10% of Canadians between the ages of 18 and 24 in 2021 experiencing suicidal ideation. And if you can wrap your head around those numbers, you'll start to get a sense of how big this catastrophe will be. Of that age group, 57% cited cost as a barrier to getting the often life-saving therapy, counseling, or psychiatric care that they need. I know from my own family's experience that it is unbelievably difficult to get psychiatric care in Canada, which means that just like with those with disabilities and many other health conditions who become eligible for assisted suicide, it's the only thing they're eligible for because it is so difficult to get the life-saving care that they need. That's why the name for this bill, as Tamara Jansen cited, is the Right to Recover Bill. The right to die or the right to recover. Unfortunately, those things are in direct conflict with each other. Across Canada, the wait list for mental health care is at minimum months, and very often it stretches into years. Again, I can speak from having talked to people personally about this. In 2022, as an example, less than 44% of those who said they needed counseling actually got counseling. Less than 44%. Of those fortunate enough to get it, only 64% said that their needs were met. Now, let me give you an idea of how the Canadian government has been approaching this. The Canadian Mental Health Association recommends that 12% of Canada's healthcare budget be spent on mental health because Canada, like many other Western nations, is enduring a mental health crisis. It's badly underfunded, it's badly understaffed. And so they recommend that 12% of Canada's healthcare budget be spent addressing mental health needs, which we've just cited for you. Despite the fact that we spend an enormous amount of money actually on euthanasia, we currently spend a mere 6.3% of our healthcare budget on mental health. That is a funding gap of $1.3 billion, a shortfall of $1.3 billion. We would have to spend $1.3 billion more to get to where the Canadian Mental Health Association says we need to be adequately funded and to start providing the services that are so desperately needed by so many Canadians, as the data that I just cited for you highlights. So this is a crisis. We have a massive vacuum right now. Mental health care is something that needs to be addressed. I think everybody watching this understands that. Most of you probably know that from personal experience. And at this time, especially at this time, to suggest that we instead are going to make lethal injections an option for people struggling with suicidal ideation is disgusting. It is horrifying. It is an exploitation of the vulnerable. Because as a result of how difficult it is to get care, millions of ordinary Canadians step up and do their best where treatment is difficult or impossible to find, or in many cases, simply too expensive to access. We all know that there are those we love who, in their worst moments of despair and mental agony, can be a threat to themselves. Most of us have, at one point or another, spent long hours trying to convey to loved ones through their suffocating veil of despair that our lives would be empty without theirs, and trying to convince them that hanging on would be really worth it. But for the first time in my life, each and every one of us faces a unique threat. A government that in less than 2 years plans to offer suicide to the suicidal while failing to offer the actual help that they so desperately need. And for the first time, taking a desperate loved one struggling with mental illness to the hospital, as I have myself, Instead of saving their lives, they could provide them a means to take their own lives. In short, as the speakers at this press conference said, our country's policies could be the greatest threat to the lives of the most vulnerable members of our own family. This bill is a huge step towards stopping that. I truly believe that many Liberal members of Parliament could be convinced to vote for it. I genuinely think that this bill has a good chance of becoming law if people step up, tell their stories, reach out to their MPs. And so I want to end by passing it back off to Member of Parliament Tamara Jansen. When she was asked at the press conference what people could do, here is what she said.
We're going to try and have people share their stories about I got better. So hashtag I got better. I believe that Andrew is going to be putting one out very soon. And we would like Canadians to share their stories. So this becomes, number one, not a taboo subject. And number two, a subject that brings broader awareness. And then I think the really big job that we as parliamentarians have is to actually reach out to our own colleagues on all sides to get them to support the bill as well. And we need help also from the regular Canadians. Go to your member of parliament and let them know you're very concerned about this situation and that you want them to support the Right to Recover bill.
Thank you all for watching this week's show on one of the most important issues facing Canadians. We're going to be keeping you updated on this story. Whenever we get more information about ways that you can get personally involved, we'll be sharing those with you. Please do share around this video so more people see the stories, so more people see the press conference, so more people can be aware of this legislation. Like the video, comment, share. We need to get the message out as far and as wide as possible. And thank you so much for your help in doing this.